Hello, welcome to our latest installment in the series of historic and environmental review training for the funding sources at Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority. Today we will be talking about the Federal Historic Tax Credit Program. I'm Carmen Leffig. I'm the Placemaking Manager of the Indiana Housing Community Development Authority.
I'm Ashley Thomas. I'm the Historic Architecture Specialist at the Indiana Department of Natural Resources Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology, and we also function as the State Historic Preservation Office in Indiana.
The goals for this training are to explain the basics of how the Federal Historic Tax Credit Program works and to provide an understanding of how this program impacts other reviews and how to plan ahead in order to streamline all the different reviews and your application materials. Much like the goals for the other trainings, we're trying to help our development partners submit the best application that they can in order for your project to move forward smoothly and quickly and get you to the construction and lease-up phases as smoothly as possible. Just a note before I turn it over to Ashley, as many of you know, IHCDA is not directly involved in the Federal Historic Tax Credit process. However, many of our rental housing tax credit applications and funded developments will utilize the historic tax credit. So the point of this training from the perspective of IHCDA is to help our future partners and current partners understand the Federal Historic Tax Credit and how that process actually will impact the implementation of your project from application to construction to lease up.
Okay, so this is just kind of a general overview of the various funding sources and reviews that we're covering in this training series as a whole. As Carmen said, today we're just focusing on the Federal Historic Tax Credit and how that process may impact the other reviews. So for the Federal Historic Tax Credit, the agencies involved are the SHPO office. We are responsible for reviewing the Federal Historic Tax Credit projects for completeness and appropriateness of treatments before forwarding that information on to the National Park Service. And then the National Park Service is ultimately responsible for the administration of the program and for the final review and approval of all proposed work. As I just mentioned, the Federal Historic Tax Credits are administered by the National Park Service. They are for income-producing properties. Buildings must be certified historic structures, which requires that the building is listed on the National Register of Historic Places by the completion of the project. 20% federal tax credits are available for qualified rehabilitation expenses, so that's basically any work on the historic structure itself. The project must meet the substantial rehabilitation test, which is a minimum expenditure requirement. Information on that can be found on the National Park Service website. All work must comply with the Secretary of the Interior standards, and after rehabilitation, the historic building must be used for income-producing purposes for at least 5 years, and during that period, all work must continue to comply with the standards. Qualified rehabilitation expenses, or QREs, are any expenditure for a structural component of the building, and additionally, any construction period interest and taxes, architect fees, engineering fees, etc. are included as listed on the screen. This is kind of a general outline from the National Park Service website of costs that are eligible and costs that are not, so it's a good reference point. So minimum expenditure is called the substantial rehabilitation test by the National Park Service. The cost must exceed either the rehabilitation cost of the building or the greater of $5,000 or the building's adjusted basis. And information on how to calculate the adjusted basis is available on the National Park Service website. Generally, this test must be met within 2 years, or if you're doing a phased project, then you have a 5-year measurement period. The Secretary of Interior standards are what we use to determine appropriate work for the historic resources. So they are published by the National Park Service and available on their website. All work reviewed under this program, as well as the Section 106 review and certificate of approval processes, must meet with the standards. So it's the same requirements across the board, which should make the reviews simpler to complete. There are 4 different treatment methods within the standards. Typically, we are looking at the rehabilitation standards. So when you're looking at the document, make sure those are the ones you're referring to. Within the standards, there are also guidelines for the treatment of historic properties, which kind of expand upon the basic standards and provide more detailed information on appropriate treatments. These are broken down into different categories, such as masonry, windows, that kind of thing. They're categorized into recommended and not recommended treatments. As long as your proposed scope of work falls in the recommended category, then your project will meet the standards. If you're doing anything in the not recommended category, that's when you need to kind of go back and reevaluate your project and see if you can bring it into compliance. We're going to really quickly walk through the process for the Federal Tax Credit Program. It's a 3-part review process. Each one has their own application form. The Part 1 covers the evaluation of significance. So basically, it certifies that the building is historic and therefore eligible to participate in the program. If your property is in a National Register listed historic district, you must verify that that building is a contributing resource through the Part 1. So this includes both a description of the current conditions of the building, a history, and then current photographs showing the overall condition of the structure. If it is an individual property that is National Register listed already, you do not have to do a Part 1 and you can skip directly to the Part 2. If it is not listed, then you would be doing the Part 1 to receive a preliminary determination of individual listing, or a PDIL, and that basically verifies that the building is eligible for listing on the National Register, and then you would then be responsible for making sure that the building gets listed by the time you go to claim your credits. The Part 2 is a description of the rehabilitation work. So this is where you provide a detailed description of the work that you're proposing and explain what kind of impact that work will have on the historic features of the property. It has to include a detailed narrative description, which is what the form is, and then you typically have to attach architectural drawings when alterations to the building are being proposed. The instructions document that's available on the NPS website states that applicants are strongly encouraged to submit applications describing proposed work and to receive approval from National Park Service prior to starting the work. Owners who undertake rehabilitation projects without prior approval from the NPS do so at their own risk. So if you start work without getting their approval first and you do something that doesn't meet the standards, the only way you can get the tax credit is by going back and redoing the work that you've already done and bringing it into compliance. So it's very important that you get the Part 2 approved prior to actually starting any construction work. The Part 3 is the request for certification of completed work. So it's submitted after the work has been completed, and you fill out a simple 1-page form with the information of whoever is going to be receiving the credit, and then you attach after photographs of the work that has been completed as described in the Part 2. This is what determines whether or not you actually receive the credit. If you claim the rehabilitation credit but never receive a Part 3 from the Park Service, then you will be subject to recapture of the credit and have to pay it all back. So you want to make sure that you complete the process appropriately. In addition to those 3 basic forms, there's also an amendment form. They can be related to Part 1, 2, or 3. They're typically used to update information that was provided in a previous submission or address any questions or conditions from National Park Service. Part 2 amendments are used to update scope of work during the project as issues and conditions result in change orders. Historic buildings have a lot of surprises hidden in them, so it's not unusual to have several Part 2 amendments for a single project. If anything changes in the scope of work between the Part 2 and the Part 3, you need to submit a Part 2 amendment updating that information prior to submitting your Part 3, just to make sure that everything will be certifiable at the end. Part 3 amendments are used for review of changes of work proposed during the 5-year period after the certification of the project. If you remember earlier, I indicated that once the project is certified, for 5 years, all work must comply with the standards, and so the Part 3 amendments is how you verify that everything you're doing from that point forward still meets the requirements. So review timelines for the federal tax credit. Each part amendment must be submitted in hard copy to the SHPO office, 2 copies of every piece of information. We have 30 days to review that information. At or before that 30-day mark, we will either request additional information or revisions to the scope of work if we have concerns, or if we think everything looks good, then we forward it on to National Park Service. National Park Service has 30 days to review anything once they get it. If they have questions, they will put the project on hold and request additional information, or they can approve it with or without conditions. Typically, conditions are used when details are not worked out yet. So for like window replacements or something like that, they might condition that but still approve your Part 2. Currently, Park Service is in the process of rebuilding their staff. They had a lot of retirements a couple years ago, and so the review at Park Service as of August of 2019 is taking between 30 and 60 days depending on the current workload out there. So you probably want to build a little bit more than 30 days into your review process. Okay, so this is just an overall look at the review timelines of all the different funding sources we're covering in these training series. So you can kind of see how they all relate. As a note, anything that has a 30-day review at SHPO, that 30 days will start over every time you submit new information. So if you provide a submission, we send you questions. When you submit the answer to those questions, that starts a new 30-day period. So you want to make sure you build in a buffer of time to allow for a little bit of back and forth, because the majority of projects are not ready to go to Park Service as soon as they come in. So you want to make sure that you allow a couple 30-day review periods. So you want to start the process as soon as possible. Some tips on helping streamline the reviews overall across all the programs. When possible, complete the Part 2 review for the Federal Historic Tax Credit prior to initiating Section 106 and the Certificate of Approval. If you're using the Federal Historic Tax Credits, they have the highest level of review out of all of the funding sources because they have to go to the National Park Service in DC. And anything that the National Park Service has concerns about and requires you to change will then impact other reviews you've already completed if you don't do this part first. So if you can receive the Park Service approval first for the Part 2, it will help streamline any of the reviews that follow it, because at that point we know that the work already meets the standards, so we don't have to do the back and forth and trying to get revisions to the scope of work if you already have their approval. Please make sure that it's clearly indicated to both IHCDA and the SHPO when multiple funding sources are involved and what those sources are to allow us to coordinate the reviews as efficiently as possible. So if you know that you're going to be using both low-income housing tax credits and federal tax credits, in addition to home funds and development funds, that's 4 different review processes. So if you let us know ahead of time, we can help guide you and make sure that you're doing them in the most logical manner, and also that we are connecting all the dots on our side so that we can streamline the reviews as efficiently as possible over here. And also, when the scope of work changes throughout the project, I mentioned amendment forms earlier for the Federal Historic Tax Credit. If you have to submit amendments, you need to also make sure that you update the other review files through IHCDA. So both the Section 106 and the C of A reviews would also need to be updated just so that all the files are staying current and we have an accurate record of the work that's actually being completed. So please make sure you allow time for that as you move through your project so that we can all stay on the same page and hopefully get things through as quickly as possible. As Carmen mentioned, this is a part of a series of trainings, and so we are also doing trainings on the other review processes, and those will be available on IHCDA's website once they are published.
And that does it for this training on the Federal Historic Tax Credits. Please be sure to pay attention to IHCDA red notices, newsletters, and our website for updates or changes to these trainings and policies. Thank you.